The next speaker is Igor Maver. Mr. Igor Maver is from the University of Ljubljana, where he teaches English literature.
Thank you. From Africa back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Actually, I'm going to talk about the Burton's travels into Slovenian lands, as they were called there then, in the so-called Duchy of Krain, or Carniola, as it is translated into English. So first, to get the context right, in 1871, as we know, Burton was moved to Trieste, where his position as a consul would give him plenty of time to write. He, of course, was a translator, a prolific author, and took a special interest also in the Eastern erotica. But, of course, he published a complete edition of the Arabian Nights as well, and died in Trieste on the 20th of October in 1890. The final description of Burton's death and funeral in Trieste shows just how well known and well liked he was. An Englishman in his adopted city, almost as an Italian, as an Austrian perhaps. He received the greatest posthumous honors in a military funeral, although later on his body was transported to England, where he is buried at Morlaix in a tomb built as an Arab desert tent. So here I'd like to quote from the fifth, I'm going to mention it later, but it's the lecture by Sir Wilson describing, well, his death and his funeral, in fact, in Trieste, to just show how highly regarded he was. Quote, on his death in Trieste on October the 20th, 1890, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Trieste conceded to him the greatest of all funeral ceremonies of the Roman Catholic Church, and the authorities a gorgeous military funeral, such as was only accorded to royalty, an honor never before accorded in Austria to a foreigner. And of the 150,000 persons who formed the population of Trieste, few who could walk did not witness it. The Diet of Trieste heard an oration in his honor, and 3 great funeral requiems were sung, with mass and all the obsequies. End of quote. So now this brings me to the Burtons and their occasional few visits to Slovenian lands in the Duchy of Carniola, as I've already pointed out. Trieste, as we have already heard today, was until the First World War the main port of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with a mixed population of Italians, Slovenes, Austrians, Greek, Jews, and also many other nationalities. Just as the Burtons went for a long cure in the famous resort of Opatia, then called Abatia, and this is where I think the second conference took place, which Mick organized, and I want to thank him for that, and also for inviting me to this particular conference in Vienna today. So Richard describes this stay in Opatia very vividly, but they also often liked to visit, so it results from the materials, the location and little hamlet of Lipica. Today's Lipica, spelled with the, in the Italian or Slovenian today way, which actually means a small lime tree in the Slavic, Slovenian language. there are still such small lime trees in the meadows there, and very pleasant to, for equestrian exercise, let's say, and performances as well, actually. Of course, today this would be on the Slovenian-Italian border, but of course at the time it was part of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy. It has been famous for its, the Lipica and the horses have been famous for their musical talent, and their sort of dashing white color. And of course, they've made their way to the Habsburg court in Vienna, where today in the Spanish riding school, Spanische Reitschule, there are, of course, these white Lipizzaner horses. Lipica, the small hamlets where which the Burtons would visit several times, is situated on the Karst plateau just above Trieste, and was probably at the time much more pleasant in the stifling hot summer month down by the sea below. As can be seen from his letters and postcards, of course he would be. So from his letters, the Burtons, of course he mentions the couple rather than just himself. The Burtons like to spend long summer periods of time in Opicina. So there is a hotel Obelisco which they visited often, as he describes it. This is today Opicina, of course, and is again right on the border almost between Slovenia and Italy. Lady Isabel and Sir Richard Burton and they would drive from there to the nearby Lipica hamlet, or this little village with the horses, and he calls this part, of course, Istria, which, of course, it's not exactly the peninsula of Istria today, but it's the northern Istria, we might maybe call it, although it's not literally on the peninsula itself. So here let me quote from Burton here, and his description of these various strips of Lipica where they did not stay. They stayed rather in the nearby Opicina, or Opcine as it is called also today. So this is the quote from his letter. Quote, one of our favorite drives was to Lipica, the Emperor's stud. It was established 300 years ago. It is about 2 hours from Trieste. You come to a kind of farm where you may get something to eat. You are then taken to the stables where the emperor keeps about 9 thoroughbred Arab stallions, and afterwards you are taken through the park where the herds of thoroughbred mares, chiefly Hungarians and Croats, most of them with foals, perhaps 200 including foals. If anything is not perfect, it is sold, and thus you can see a very good breed of horses in Trieste, often drawing a cart. The pleasantest way to make this trip for your own comfort is to take a luncheon basket for yourself and nose bags with corn for your horses, as well as a small tub or pail to draw water from them, as nothing will induce them, and rightly, to let your horses come anywhere near the stud, or to drink out of anything belonging to their horses. And 2 hours there and 2 hours back is a long way for animals to go without drink or any refreshment. End of quote. Of course, here he would be referring to the trip directly from Trieste, of course, much closer from the Opicina hotel, which they also frequented. So let me now, I mean, there's not much more material about his visits of Slovenian lands, but I decided also to say a word about this lecture that took place. It was the fifth lecture on Burton, the fifth memorial lecture on Burton, which took place on the 27th of May 1937, and it never got to the sixth one, as Mick today mentioned. So, in this lecture, Sir Arnold Wilson speaks about various aspects of his work and his travels, obviously. I could say that, well, whether or not Burton was an Orientalist or not, it's a debated issue in the, with the positive or negative connotation, mostly negative, I guess. But of course, he I would say he often decided to go native, in other words, in inverted commas, and immerse in the society he was part of, and maybe, feel with the other, and so on. In his texts, he actually sometimes quite openly criticizes the colonial policies and practices of the British Empire, which also can be seen from this published fifth lecture and the various quotes that Sir Wilson, who delivered the lecture, presented there in 1937. He is, in fact, Sir Wilson, in this lecture from 1937, he's quite apologetic as far as his, imperial colonial enterprise is concerned, postulating him as a person that saw contemporary British reality sometimes, not always, but sometimes, as less humane than that in Africa, for example, especially as regards the downright inhuman punishment and prison system. And he goes on quoting Sir Arnold from Burton's Galilee. Quote, at times he would rebuke, Burton of course, the manners and customs of this country by comparing them to those of some savage land. Female criminals are executed by officers of their own sex within the palace walls and not in presence of men. Dahomey in Africa is therefore in one point more civilized than Great Britain, where they still hang even women in public, and in 1864, we hung for 4 murderers on the same gibbet before 100,000 gaping souls at Liverpool. Then he goes on and reminds us that Negroes did not, at their worst, invent the hideous punishments of 18th century Europe, nor, as in England, hang boys and girls and men and women for trifling offenses. And he goes on in this same way, in this same vein. Sir Arnold Wilson, in this published lecture, the fifth published lecture, clearly cannot avoid Burton's famous translation of the Arabian Nights into English, which came out between 1885 and 1888. And let me conclude by, saying that it was probably one of his, not probably, definitely I'd say his greatest commercial and financial success, on which he worked, stationed in Trieste as the British consul on a very meager salary, as we have also heard today, and also he was not very happy being posted to Trieste in the first place. But of course, the literary production was very good and very successful in this town. So let me stop at this point and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Igor. So we will leave the questions for lunch.